Hey there, everyone. My name is Andrew Jobling, the accidental author. It's great to be here with the wonderful Michael Harris, all the way on the other side of the world in Bend, Oregon. How are you, Michael?
I'm really great. How are you today, Andrew?
Fabulous. Fabulous.
Yeah, yeah,
And thank you for your time. It's wonderful. You're very generous. We have done a podcast together, and by the time people are listening to this video cast, that podcast will be out in the world. And that was very inspiring podcast,
yeah,
mate. Podcast.
yeah. I really appreciate connecting with you. We connected originally through Podmatch, and there's so many similarities in what we do. And I love your line about being the accidental author, because I think in some ways many of us are like that have written books. It's just like I didn't grow up thinking I was going to write a book, but then I did.
And that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you're the author now of three books, correct? And your latest one is Falling Down, Getting Up, or was that your first one?
That was the first one was Falling Down, Getting Up. The latest one is Podmatch Guest Mastery, which is about podcasting. And then I've got another one coming out, which I'm not going to say too much about, but it will be coming out middle of this year.
That's awesome. That's so good. And mate, we won't dig deep into your story, but you definitely have a story. People need to listen to the podcast to hear your story. You know, you've been through a lot. You know, a very significant skiing accident as a child that led you down a pretty dark path into addiction and a whole range of things. And there was a moment, I think you said you were 30 when all of a sudden you said, no, things are going to change for me, and you pretty much transformed your life. And so there's a pretty powerful story you've got. And so you decide to write a book. Isn't that interesting? You're right. I mean, I call myself accidental author, but I don't believe there are accidents in life. I just think things are unlikely. And you know, from a background point of view, nothing pointed towards me being an author. I don't know about you, mate, whether you loved writing or reading or any of that. I didn't like any of it. For me, it was about a message. It was about, you know, a way to have an impact on the world. So tell us a bit about them. Then what was the motivation for you? What was that trigger for you to write that first book called Falling Down, Getting Up?
Well, people kept prodding me and saying, things, and I didn't necessarily like what they were saying. They're saying, "Oh, you're a miracle. You should write a book about what happened to you. You shouldn't be alive. Why are you here? You need to tell other people about it." And it really made me uncomfortable for a number of years, probably a good 10 years. I was really uncomfortable with that, and I would shy away from it. And then just one day it was just like, well, maybe I'll write something down, but I probably won't release a book, but I'll write about it. So that was kind of my first step, was to sit down and start writing about some of what had happened into my life. And I mean, like you said, I mean, I had a significant water skiing accident. They took out 65% of my liver. This was 1971, 21 blood transfusions, cracked ribs, collapsed lung, coma, near-death experience. After that, diving into addictions and drinking too much, and then ending up with vascular disease and in my 20s and nearly getting my legs amputated at 27 and 28, two different times they wanted to do it. And like you said, I came to a point where I had had enough. So all these things had happened to me, and I'm 64 now. I got sober when I was 30. So I've been sober for a long time, and somehow I'm still here. And again, I mean, it's like your tears of joy. I love that. Your cover of your book, and your book there, because it felt like sometimes I got these tears of joy. So I haven't read your book, but I'm going to need to get a copy of your
You
book.
definitely need to get a copy.
Yeah,
I need to
yeah,
get a copy of yours.
yeah. Absolutely. I'll send you one. Um, and again, people kept saying, "Oh, you need to write a book. You need to write a book." And finally I wrote a book, and I wrote it through some publishers called Morgan James. A guy named David Hancock was the publisher, and Rick Fishman. And I told them, I said, "I'm not a writer." And they said, "Well, you just wrote a book, so you're a writer." So I mean, it was even hard for me to take on, the title that I was now a writer, because like in school and stuff, I mean, I was mediocre. I mean, I liked writing some of my writing assignments, but it wasn't like, like, oh gosh, I'm going to be a writer my whole life. There's no way.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that
Yeah.
where our beliefs come from? Now, you said for 10 years it was uncomfortable for you. Why was it so uncomfortable for you to write about your story?
Well, part of it is I didn't want people to know like part of my story, especially once I started diving into drinking and all of that. Is just like, no, I'm not going to tell that part of my story. Yet there was a freedom that I experienced in telling the story.
Yeah. So
Right?
initially it was a fear of judgment, but then after you wrote it, it was this freedom, that feeling of freedom of actually getting it out of your system and out.
Yeah.
How did
Yeah.
people
It's like,
respond? I mean, because it's interesting. See, and I think this is a really important point because a lot of people feel uncomfortable about writing the story, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is probably the same reason is they don't want people to know about the truth,
right.
the real flawed, imperfect person, insecure person that they are.
Yeah.
We all are, by the way. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is because they don't think their story is that interesting, or they don't think anyone's going to relate to that story. So how did people respond to your story? Once they read it, what kind of feedback were you getting?
Well, I'll give an example of a friend of mine, Brad. He teaches yoga. He teaches yoga all over the world, lives up in Canada mostly, but teaches all over. And we'd known each other for probably a decade by the time my book came out. And he read my book and he went, oh my God, I had no idea. Because he didn't know all, the details of some of what I talked about in the book. He says, how are you still here? You shouldn't still be here. And so I get a lot of that. And, so a lot of my friends had that response. Some other friends of mine said, it's about time you put it out. And then I was fortunate enough, too, that some of the listeners may have heard of this gentleman, J. Carmen Levinson. He was the father of guerrilla marketing, and he forwarded the book. And I sent him the manuscript through my publisher, and he thought that Jay should read my manuscript. And I thought, well, that's really off base of what he does because he's a marketer, right? And he told me later that he read it twice the same day that he got it. He says he was so enthralled with it. He said it was like guerrilla marketing, except for your life, to save your life rather than to market a product. He said, you did the same thing in your story. He says, you talked about everything that you did that was maybe not so mainstream, but kept you alive.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I had different responses depending upon who was saying it.
Did anyone judge you? That fear that you had of being judged by putting it out there and telling your truth, I'm sure, about your addiction and a lot of that stuff. Did you get any of that, or were people supportive and encouraging and um, loving towards you?
No, I got some of that. And when I was talking to Rick Frischman, he said, expect to get, letters or emails from people that don't like your book. I went, really? And so the first one I got was like, oh, this didn't feel very good. But then, I haven't got a lot, but I certainly have had half a dozen or 6, 7, 8. And I started to relish them because it was like, oh, I got to somebody, because I would get emails too from somebody to say, oh, I read your book and it gave me hope to stop drinking. It gave me hope that my medical condition could get better. It got hope that my chronic pain could go away. So I got a lot of those,
You
but I
got you
also
got way more positives than you got negatives. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And isn't it interesting? And this is a really important point for people watching this because they're going to get that, we are going to get different reactions and responses to our book and our story for sure.
Yeah.
And it's far less about the story and far more about the place where that person that's reading it is in, so obviously the people that said to you, thank you, you've inspired me to give up drinking or to do something about my addiction problems. they're people that have already maybe taken responsibility and thought, I need to do something, and your book's given them the encouragement and hope to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
On the other
Yeah.
hand, you've got some of these negatives coming in, and these are probably people that have got addiction problems, but they're not ready to face it yet. They're not willing to take responsibility. So what your book has done is actually really highlighted to them that they're at fault and they don't like that. So rather than take responsibility, they're going to lash out at you.
Yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
that's a really
100%.
important point for people to get. Negative feedback on a book is far more about the person giving the feedback than it is about the content of your book, because that same content is inspiring people and helping people and moving people in the right direction.
Yeah.
That's also, challenging people that are not ready to take responsibility for themselves. So I think that's an important point.
And it comes from all sorts of different places. Like I said, I mean, I've got emails of people that didn't like it. And then maybe 6 months ago or so, the town I live in, I was walking down the street and this woman came up to me and she said, "You're that author. You wrote that book, Falling Down, Getting Up." And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "Did you read it?" And she says, "Yeah." I said, "Well, where'd you get the book?" And in some neighborhoods, they have those little book boxes, like a mini library. You go up and people have put books in it. That's where she got it. I have no idea how she got it there. So somebody had read the book and put it in one of those little neighborhood library boxes, and she read the book. And it was
What did
just
she
like,
say about it? Did
well,
she say anything?
she did. She apparently had gotten sober recently, and she says it really inspired me.
Oh,
You
see,
know,
yes.
yeah, and that's what it's about.
That's what it's about. And,
Yeah,
and and it's not just about that one lady. What about the ripple effect of her ending her addiction or
right.
taking positive steps? So your book is creating this amazing ripple effect. And I think it's important to note, and I think this is a message for this video cast, is that all feedback you get about your book is great. It's all
Yeah,
amazing because, as you said, Michael, you got through. Those
yeah,
people have reacted in a negative way. What you've done is you've started the process for their healing. Now it
yeah,
starts off with anger, and it starts off with you know head in the sand, kind of, it's not me, it's not my fault. But that's the first step, right? Like
yeah,
that anger, that resentment is the first step to their own personal journey of healing.
yeah,
All
yeah.
feedback is great.
Absolutely. So, like you said, pushing that button can be good. You know,
It's fantastic. Good on you, mate. So tell us, since you've now become an author, and again, because I know people watching this going, well, that's great. It's great to have a book and it's great to have an impact. What other things have you been able to do as a result? What's doors has the book opened, these books opened up for you?
great question. Again, the first book, Falling Down book, was released in July 2012, right? And so now it's January 2023, right? 11 years later. Not this Friday, but the following Friday, the time of this recording, I'm doing a big local event where we're playing a movie called All the Rage, which is about a guy named Dr. John Sarno. And there's everybody from Gabor Mate in it, and David Clark, and Larry David, and just a whole slew of different people talking about overcoming chronic pain. And then at the end of the movie, we're having a live discussion brought another doctor in, a guy named Dr. David Clark, which is assistant director of ethics at OHSU, Oregon Health Sciences University, and head of what's called the PPDA, the Psychophysiological Disorder Association. And we're going to be talking about overcoming chronic pain and healing without opiates or painkillers or surgery. So the reason that I'm doing this event is because of the book from 11 years ago.
Yeah. So things are still happening. Opportunities are still coming up for you because of that book you wrote 11 years ago. Wow.
It's still happening. People are still buying it. Yeah. Yeah.
And we're having conversations on podcasts and video casts, and your messages, it's opening up all these doors for you, which is awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the main reason that I'm on podcasts, and the main reason that when I had my podcast, why I had it.
Yeah.
Because of the book.
That's awesome. So, Michael, as we wrap this up, one piece of advice for people listening to this that are or watching this that are in a process of writing their book, trying to get published, trying to get out there, what would you say to them to encourage them and inspire them?
Sure. Well, depending upon where they are in the process, whether they put pen to paper or not, first thing I would do is just encourage them to put pen to paper. Start to put your story down. You know, I did this process. I like to say I took 10 years and 79 days to write it because I was thinking about it for so long, but I made a commitment when I did sit down to write it, and it took me 79 days. I did 2 hours a day of writing for 79 days, and I had the book written. You know, the manuscript. It wasn't edited yet for that.
Of course, first draft.
And then, you know, there's all sorts of publishing options, you know, gazillion self-publishing options. There's different types of authors. Don't necessarily expect to go out and sell 10,000 books in your first week. It probably won't happen, but you can get the ball rolling, you get the bus moving. You know, I was fortunate when I got my book published, I never even had to submit it to anybody. I ran into a publisher in New York City. I didn't know he was a publisher. And I started talking to him, and it was on a Friday. And by the following Wednesday, we had a book deal. Never even submitted the manuscript.
I think I said this on the podcast. I think there's a lot of people right now wanting to punch you in the nose because we've been sending out manuscript after submission. But like, that's just the way it works. It'll happen when it's meant to happen.
And I was looking for 50 pink slips. I mean, I was really expecting that. And it was going to be part of my story. Oh, it took me all these pink slips. But instead, part of my story is I didn't have to do that. It just happened.
Well, you attracted that. And I think that's important. But before we finish, mate, I just want you to explain to the listeners that haven't heard the podcast yet, the law of Goya. Because I think this is the key law, mate, the law of Goya, Goya. Explain what that is, mate.
This is a great segue because I'm going to do a shout out for my brother because this relates to my brother. My brother, Bill Harris, was one of the contributing authors in The Secret and helped Rhonda Byrne with the book and getting that book out. And the book Secret is all about the law of attraction. And so, you know, it talks about, you know, sitting around thinking you're going to get $10 million from Aunt Mabel, and it's probably not going to happen, right? So John Assaraf came up with this term called the law of Goya. Wasn't my term, you know, and Goya is get off your ass. So you actually got to take action to make it happen, right? So you can attract, like, you know, everything, like even my book. I wrote it, you know, I wanted to attract a publisher. Here comes one down the street, started talking, and he published my book.
Yeah. But you have to take action. And I think that the key part of the law of attraction, the biggest misconception about law of attraction is you just have to focus and imagine and it's all just going to magically appear. No, it's not. You need to apply the law of Goya to make the law of attraction work.
Yeah.
Law of attraction without the law of action will never work. You must take action. Mate, this has been wonderful. Thank you for just this short little time together. Very inspiring. So, Michael, it's going to come up on the screen as you say it, but what's your website? How do people reach you? How do they find you if they want to buy your books or reach out to you in any way?
Well, they can buy in any of the books at any bookstore, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any online shop, or many of the local stores as well. And then the best place to reach me is just my website, michaelbharris.com.
And that's on the screen right now as we speak. Michael, thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful. You're doing incredible stuff. Keep up the great work. Keep Goyering. Goyering. That's a new word, Goyering. You're Goyering.
That's a great one. I like it.
Yeah. Everyone, get Goyering. Get off your ass. Anyway, thanks, Michael. Wonderful chatting. And look forward to hearing about your next book as it comes out.
Thanks, man.